Welcome in to another edition of Friar Territory here on the Foul Territory Network. I'm Kyle Glaser, joined today by a very, very special co-host, Darnay Tripp, of course, lead sports anchor for NBC 7 San Diego. Darnay, thank you for joining me, my friend.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Of course, Darnay has been kind enough to have me on his podcast many times. And today I am returning the favor as we break down the top takeaways from Craig Stammen's introductory press conference as Padres manager. Darnay, let's kick it right to you. What stood out to you about the presser today, and what were your main takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can come at it from a few different angles. There's always, you've covered your fair share of these types of events, and there can be like a little bit of that like awkwardness feeling out process between, say AJ Preller on one side of the stage and whoever is next to him, in this case Craig Stammen. I think what was immediately evident was just kind of the comfort level between those two, and then Craig Stammen kind of in that position, in these surroundings, being back with the Padres, talking once again to reporters that he spoke with in the clubhouse on a near daily basis for 6 seasons of his big league career. And so for a guy that, this part of it is all going to be brand new to him, and we don't know if he can do the job. And I'm not entirely sure if Craig Stammen knows that whether or not he can do the job, but he's got the willingness to learn and to lean on those around him. But in spite of that, there seems to be just a comfort level with him being there. Obviously, the team, how highly thought of he is in that clubhouse, his relationship with AJ Preller, and just kind of some of the signs, the moments along the way where Preller identified him as somebody they wanted to keep around the organization with something like this in mind down the road. I just don't think any of us expected that last Thursday and the last week was down the road.
No question about it. What stood out to me, first and foremost, in addition to that comfort, was the humility. And look, you covered Craig Stammen for many, many seasons in San Diego. I covered Craig Stammen many, many seasons in San Diego. We were both there in 2020 in an empty stadium when he came out and, led the Padres that game through victory. And there are a lot of positive traits here. I think from the Padres' perspective, let's start with the positives, right? So first and foremost, you and I both know, having dealt with Craig Stammen for many, many years, he is a very, very bright individual, both in terms of baseball and just life in general. He is very much a natural leader. He was a leader throughout his time with the Padres. He was very much the leader of the bullpen unit. And one of the things that I talked about on the show last week that AJ Preller brought up in the presser today was during the COVID season. Craig Stammen very much was the front-facing spokesperson for the players in a time of great angst, uncertainty, when things were rough and no one quite knew what was going on. It was a time of turmoil throughout Major League Baseball. Stammen was the guy. He was the front-facing, calming presence who, both in terms of dealings with the media and as a conduit to the front office, really stepped up and took the lead. So I think that says a lot about who he is. And look, even though he was a relief pitcher and obviously his role is kind of segmented into one distinct part of the game, he knows baseball, right? This is a very, very bright baseball mind. I think the personality, the humility, the intelligence, the willingness to learn, there's a genuine aspect of him. All these are character traits that will serve him well. So if you're looking for the positives, that's who Craig Stammen is. And again, it came through in the press conference today. He's very genuine. The guy you see is the guy you get. There's no, front here.
Yeah, no question about that. And AJ Preller, almost word for word, said that just in talking about the genuine nature of Craig Stammen, and that obviously being a key aspect in how he's developed such close relationships and has the trust of the guys within the clubhouse, and that's something he's going to obviously have to kind of build on now in that new role. And so that's now the interesting element of it, is like, how do those relationships evolve? How do
Right.
those conversations evolve? The nature of those relationships and those interactions, because he is used to interacting with those guys as teammates and as peers. And the last couple of years as a special assistant, maybe it started that process of evolving a little bit. But now it you would think would be different than it had been in the past. And that was, he had a really interesting answer when he was asked about that, towards the end of the press conference and wanting to just kind of motivate his best friends. He said just that little bit, that 1% to maybe help them kind of achieve their goals. And Jason Adam, who wasn't a teammate of Craig Stammen's, but has been around him for the last year plus, 2 seasons, I guess, for the better part of 2 seasons, and can relate to him as being a fellow reliever, and now seeing him go into this transition. He's like, look, everybody acts like a manager is a high school baseball coach, where you're yelling at your players and you're telling them to run laps and that sort of thing. That's not the case. You're relating to them on a similar level. They're grown men. You have to hold them accountable, and I think they believe that Craig Stammen is the type of guy that's going to hold those guys accountable. And you mentioned kind of the COVID situation that AJ Preller brought up. Craig Stammen having the willingness to have a serious sit-down conversation with former owners Ron Fowler and Peter Seidler, hearing their ideas and having to push back and say, no, this is what we need from a player standpoint, and that being kind of one of those light bulb moments for AJ Preller, where he knew there was the leadership piece, but also the decision making and the ability to kind of communicate a serious, a firm message and say, I understand your perspective. This is why it might not be correct. And that's obviously something he's going to now have to do more frequently in his new role.
And that's the big question. And we'll get to some of we talked about the positives. We'll get to the quote unquote negatives here in a second. I do want to start with having covered Craig Stammen and having also covered Albert Pujols. I was up in Anaheim a lot during those years as a national writer. If it came down to which one of those guys would be a better manager for the Padres, Craig Stammen's actually the answer. When it comes to ego, when it comes to willingness to adapt and learn new things, when it comes to just being able to relate to players on a more even level as opposed to someone, expecting immediate deference, Craig Stammen's the better pick there. He absolutely is. That said, the biggest challenge that he will face, and I actually thought if there's one part of this press conference, I don't want to say concerned me, but raised my eyebrows a little bit, was what you referenced, the conversation about, it's about motivating my best friends. There are lines you can't cross as a manager with your players that you can player to player. And this is something David Ross really struggled with in Chicago, that when you have been these guys' teammates, again, it's a different relationship, and all of a sudden it can be very, very difficult for them to see in a different light when it's so soon. Again, he was pitching on this team in 2022. It's 2025 to be 2026. A lot of the core guys were teammates with him. So I think for me, again, I really, really want to be careful here because I do think Craig Stammen is a high quality individual. I think the world of him as a person, as a leader, just as a man in general. But that is something that will have to change because there are going to be times where, whether it's Manny Machado and Fernando Tatis, or maybe it's someone that's lower down on the roster, it's lower profile, that he is going to have to get on. There are going to be moments where you do have to be a little bit of a disciplinarian and say, hey, again, if a guy doesn't run out a ground ball once, that's one thing. But if a guy is constantly costing his team outs, you need to get on him and you need to make it very clear that's unacceptable. And the good managers do that. They know you can't be that way all day, every day for 162 games a year, but they pick their spots and they know when they have to do it. I'm going to be curious to see if when Manny is trying to play through an injury and he's hurting the team, or if he does cost the team outs by not running out ground balls, or when Fernando Tatis Jr., if he gets in one of his sullen moods, is Craig Stammen going to go to them and say, hey, we're not doing this, pick it up? I don't know the answer to that, and to be 100% honest, coming out of this press conference, I did not come out of it with more faith that he will be able to. Not less faith either, but my faith level wasn't increased.
And I think that's fair. I'm sure Craig Stammen is going to do it in his Craig Stammen way, and that's the part where we just don't know. Each manager is going to kind of have their own approach, and so what that looks like for Craig Stammen, we don't know. And will those relationships be an asset for him and make those conversations easier, or will they maybe not take him so seriously because he's a friend and he was a former teammate, and it might be harder for him to kind of take that firm stance with them? That's the big there's two huge questions: is how do those relationships evolve, and how does he handle those situations, and what is his aptitude when it comes to managing the ins and outs of baseball games, a incredibly unpredictable sport where there are situations, just in terms of the game itself, with rules, personality dynamics that can kind of flare up, the decisions in terms of the lineup and how you use your pitching staff, that you just simply cannot plan for. And any manager would be caught off guard by through the course of the season, much less somebody who has not done it before. I think going back to what you said initially, Craig Stammen has that humility, and
Yes.
he said it himself. This isn't going to be the Craig Stammen show. Ruben Niebla, who, from the sounds of it, I think when they announced their staff, I wouldn't be surprised if Ruben Niebla has a different title.
Yes.
How his role evolves, because he's somebody that he thinks very highly of, and said he's going to be leaning on a great deal. So I think he knows that about himself. I think that's an important first step. But even that being the case, you're going to be facing the live bullets. You're going to have seconds to make a decision, and that decision could cost you a game or games. And that's going to be a question that follows him well into the season.
This episode of FT is brought to you by Square. Your favorite neighborhood spots run on Square. Give me an example in Pennsylvania, Kratz.
Right down the street from my house, the Tap House. Not only is it an awesome place to hang out, get your beers, get your drinks, whatever it is, but you know what? The company has the simplicity of Square, and they give back to the community with 10% of all the proceeds that they bring in going back to community projects.
I love it. Sports and sports bars are so good at bringing together local communities, and you can actually take this ad as an excuse to go support your local spot and have yourself a day or a weekend in the neighborhood. Square is a proud partner of more than 4 million neighborhood businesses around the world. These businesses are what make the neighborhood the neighborhood. So visit square.com/go/foul to learn more. But before you do, go support your favorite neighborhood spot. You'll be happy you did. Square. See you in the neighborhood. Again, that's square.com/go/foul to learn more.
And that is something that I think we need to dive into in depth here. There has definitely been an upsurge in the number of ex-players hired to be managers with zero previous managerial or coaching experience. And when I say managerial experience, I'm including time in the minor leagues, because those 4, 5, 6 years working your way up the ladder, those absolutely play a huge role in preparing you for being a big league manager. When you look at the guys who were hired without any previous managerial or coaching experience, over the last 15 years, there are some successes, there are some failures, just like any manager hire. The successes would be Aaron Boone. A lot of people don't realize Craig Counsell came straight from a front office role. He had no previous coaching or managerial experience when the Brewers hired him. It was a mid-season hire, so different dynamic, but he's one example. Mike Matheny had his ups and downs. He did take the Cardinals to a World Series. So, again, Boone, Counsell, Matheny, these are all guys who have put together track records of consistent winning seasons, were able to be successful. Brad Ausmus had some initial success with the Tigers as well. So these are all guys who were hired without any previous managing or coaching experience. At the same time, when you look back at the last 31 World Series champions, so since 1995, the wild card era, every single World Series winning team, their manager either had previous big league managerial experience or at least 2 years as a coach on a big league staff. All different roles: pitching coach, hitting coach, bench coach, third base coach, first base coach, but every single one of them in the wild card era had at least 2 years of that experience. And that to me is where, at the end of the day, there are just some things that no matter how great your personality, no matter if you're the right fit in so many ways, and I think Craig Stammen is, there's experiences that you just can't prepare for. And you can only become a World Series caliber manager once you have those experiences and you've lived them. And we've seen that historically. I think for me, that's where when the Padres talk about, we want to win a World Series right now, not 3 years from now, but right now, that's where there's a disconnect. I'm big on historical precedent, and I'm going to repeat it. In the wild card era, every single manager who has won a World Series either had previous managerial experience or at least 2 years of experience on a big league coaching staff.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite the stat. And, you would think there is something to that. When you look at the possibilities here for the Padres, Now, I guess Ruben Niebla wouldn't necessarily fit that mold because he's been on
He
the
would.
Padres staff
He had
for
2 years of experience on the as a coach on the Padres staff, so he would have hit that qualification.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So, making him different from Craig Stammen in this respect, Albert Pujols, do you count Winter League? He's
No.
obviously, hasn't come up on the WBC, but it looks like he'll be potentially managing the Dominican. All that to say, the Padres, all their candidates kind of fit that mold with the exception of Ruben Niebla, and obviously Ruben was somebody who sounded very impressive, as you'd expect him to, in that setting, and somebody they gave real consideration to. And for whatever reason, AJ Preller had pinpointed Craig Stammen in his mind for a while now, and had to convince him to pursue the job. And here we are. And clearly, they, and AJ was, of course, asked about this and said, hey, you see lots of different profiles of managers get hired and have success, and it sounds very similar to things that AJ Preller has said in the past. They have clearly prioritized the fit, the chemistry, those relationships over experience. And whether or not that comes back to bite them, we'll see. I will say, having covered this team through the years and the last season of Andy Green on, it seemed like the breaking down of relationships, whether it be with AJ Preller, whether it be in the clubhouse, whether it be with the surrounding coaching staff, seemed to be part of the equation for Mike Schilt, caused these early, after year 2 type of exits. Yes. And so maybe from their standpoint, they're saying, okay, things seem to break down between Jay Singler and AJ Preller. Things seem to break down between Bob Melvin and AJ Preller. Things seem to break down between Mike Schilt and a whole bunch of people in the clubhouse. If we have somebody whose baseball acumen we trust just enough, but know his relationship acumen, his ability to kind of communicate, to build strong bonds, maybe that will be the thing that can kind of create some stability in that position. As we know, winning determines a lot of these things. And we like to believe that, good vibes and strong bonds and relationships can contribute to that, or can at least kind of stem the tide. When you mentioned Fernando Tatis Jr.'s slump, the offense is not clicking the way it should. Maybe having somebody that's going to hold a guy accountable, you can have a hard conversation with, maybe making a lineup adjustment, which Mike Schilt seemed very hesitant to do this year, can be the difference for them. But, and look, everybody's experienced until they're not, right? And so if he can get past that 2-year hump into year 3 and year 4, now part of the equation here is whatever the Padres championship window looks like. So don't ask me what the roster is going to look like in 4 years. And what's the state of Manny Machado and Xander Bogaerts and all that. Hopefully it doesn't take that long, but I think Craig Stammen knows he's going to have to learn on the job. He's going to have to learn quickly on the job. He has a willingness to do so. But it is a tall ask for him to kind of buck a trend that, like you said, is now 3+ decades deep.
Yeah, and then it kind of extends to even reaching the World Series. So I talk about every World Series winning manager since 1995, the start of the wild card era, had either previous managerial experience or at least 2 years of coaching experience on a big league staff. If you look at the managers of teams who reached the World Series and lost, all but 2 also had either previous coaching experience or previous managerial experience in the big leagues. And the 2 exceptions are Aaron Boone and Mike Matheny. Matheny, things got off to a really, really nice start. They kind of fell apart. Aaron Boone is tricky because on the one hand, the record's been really good. The Yankees were in the World Series in 2024. There's been a lot of on-paper success. I would also argue the Yankees have been one of the most poorly coached teams in baseball over the last half-decade. When you just look at defensive fundamentals, mental mistakes on the base pass. I mean, they've been atrocious to watch at times. And at the end of the day, that comes down to coaching. So again, there's a risk here. And I saw someone make a comment about, Bruce Bochy had no, previous experience either. That's not correct. Bruce Bochy was a manager for 4 seasons in the minors and then was the Padres' third base coach for 2 seasons before taking over as manager. He had half a decade of experience as a manager and a coach. So again, I think for me it comes down to, on the one hand, like you stated, Craig Stammen is absolutely the type of person that you want leading your team. And I'm going to repeat this, right? Because it bears repeating. Talk about baseball acumen, you talk about leadership skills, you talk about emotional intelligence, all the things that matter, he has them, and he has them in spades. It's just that in-game managerial experience to get to a World Series championship level. There's nothing that can replicate that. And so from the Padres' perspective, they are taking a risk here. And I think at the end of the day, this presser, my main takeaway from it was it confirmed a lot of what we already knew. And Craig Stammen represented himself extremely well, as he always does. Mm-hmm. But there are still going to be unanswered questions that really can't be answered until the regular season actually starts.
No question about it. And I'm glad Craig didn't have a line like Jace Tingler's infamous, "I've managed a lot of games" in my mind. Yeah. But I've thought about that a little bit, just like what has his preparation been like? And, I think he was asked about it. It seems like something he thought a little bit about as a player, but, again, this wasn't something that he necessarily even envisioned for himself. So I don't think it was the type of situation where he was sitting there in 2022, or 2021 on thinking, okay, let me glean everything I can now to get ready for this opportunity. I think the last couple of years have contributed to that. And AJ, I forget exactly what the question was, but it's when we were off to the side afterwards, mentioned that, Craig was one of the guys that was in part of uniform staff, and so he wasn't necessarily like a front office guy who's like upstairs the entire time and isn't around and isn't part of these kind of meetings and interactions. Like, he was getting his hands dirty and I'm sure will, be able to come away with some of those or draw on some of those experiences from the last couple of years under Mike Schilt. That was another thing that came up on multiple occasions was, and I think, that was kind of the one of the big questions. And when we found out about Craig Stammen, just the thought that, okay, there's going to be some continuity here. Yeah. Mike Schilt came up on multiple occasions today, just in terms of Craig saying, hey, great manager, look what he's done. I've learned a lot from him and we want to keep it going. Like, he's instilled a culture with this team, a winning mindset that they want to kind of continue forth. And so again, that, speaks to his humility, but also maybe points to some of the lessons that he's learned that he'll be able to kind of carry forward. They're not completely starting from scratch, especially when you think of Ruben Niebla and others on the staff. They want to kind of continue the momentum that Mike Schilt generated over the last couple of years and some of the characteristics of the team that have emerged during that time. Craig was there. He was, able to observe that and hopefully learn like what it takes to kind of set that tone in the clubhouse. And now, wants to kind of continue that forward in Mike Schilt's absence.
And that's an important point, because what Mike Schilt built is a team that was going to play clean, fundamental baseball. The players were going to hold themselves accountable. And on the whole, whatever his shortcomings with his relationships with staff, even his detractors acknowledge he made them better coaches. He was hard on them, but he made them better coaches. So Craig Stammen is walking into a very good situation. And I do want to highlight one of the things that I was curious about is how often has a manager with no previous managerial or coaching experience taken over a 90-plus win team? And there are 3 instances of that. Talked about Aaron Boone, talked about Mike Matheny, and the other was Brad Ausmus with the Tigers. And in each case, they were successful immediately their first season, and really their first 2 seasons. In the cases of Matheny and Ausmus, it started to decline a little bit. Ausmus, the decline started a little bit earlier. Boone, again, has had sustained success. Some of that is the Yankees, some of that is their payroll, and some of it is just the expectations of New York and what that franchise is. So, again, I don't think it will be a shock if the Padres come out and are successful again. That has precedent. And again, you look at some of the other guys who were hired without previous experience. I mentioned Craig Counsell. The first 2 years were rebuilding years and they struggled, but he eventually figured it out and became one of the best managers in baseball. Guys like Scott Service, Robin Ventura, Walt Weiss, all guys who were initially hired without that experience. There's been successes and failures. So it's not that Craig Stammen can't be successful, won't be successful from the standpoint of, hey, can they win 90 games again? Can they be a playoff team again? There's precedent for that. And I do think that Craig Stammen, and again, he showed this throughout his playing career. He showed it again in the press conference today. he has the it factor for it. All the things you need to be a successful manager, baseball knowledge, the relationships, the ability to navigate different dynamics, that natural leadership that some guys are just born with, he has it. We've all seen it for years. I just wonder what the upside is. Just given the historical precedent, I think 90 plus wins is absolutely very, very feasible. Reaching a World Series, it's rare, but there is precedent for guys who have no previous managerial or coaching experience doing it in their first time on the job. But winning a World Series would be unprecedented, and it's a risk the Padres have taken, and we can debate how wise it was.
So part of the equation too will be, what is the state of the roster? Does it end up being a World Series caliber roster? And I think the good thing about the situation he's walking into, as you mentioned, 90 plus wins, back-to-back playoff appearances. There's a lot of work to do in that rotation.
Yes.
There's not a whole lot of work to do in terms of the lineup itself, first base being kind of the one obvious hole, power slug being the obvious need for this team. But you're going to almost certainly have to replace Dylan Cease. Maybe have to replace Michael King. I think there's probably some hope, at least from a fan standpoint, that they can come to terms. I think Ruben Niebla sticking around probably doesn't
Huge.
hurt your case there. But there, you're not going to have Yu Darvish. We'll see how Joe Musgrove looks coming off Tommy John. That's part of it as well. And I think we've seen flashes, I think even right after the trade deadline, with the moves that they made and the way they played once Ramon Laureano arrived. You think, okay, this is a team that could maybe make a run.
Yeah.
And then they just kind of, things sort of slowed down once they got into September, and we saw offensively them go quiet there in the postseason. How much they're going to spend, how they fill those holes. Obviously, the work that AJ Preller, he was masterclass in 2024, and I think did some really good things, especially at the trade deadline in 2025. But there's some serious glaring needs, and some of that stuff, Craig Stammen, whoever the manager is, probably wouldn't be able to overcome. So it's those confluence of factors, how they all come together. But yeah, the question will be, if you're looking at a roster that should be competitive, should be able to win in the postseason, what is Craig Stammen doing when it's time to make an important move in a key game, or adjust the lineup when they're in a slump, or connect with a player, a Fernando Tatis Jr. when they're struggling? Is he able to elevate the team, help them reach their potential? I mean, that's something Bob Melvin struggled to do. And I think when he was hired, we were all sitting here thinking, wow, A+ hire, they've got their guy for the next decade.
Yeah, and I will say too, you've mentioned Ruben Niebla a few times. A big part of this is it's not just going to be Craig Stammen. Every successful manager has great coaches under him. Having Ruben Niebla come back is going to be huge. Having Ben Fritz come back as the bullpen coach is going to be huge. And I think it gives the Padres, as it should, some confidence that they will be able to, perhaps, if they have to, go with some lower cost free agent signings in terms of starting pitchers and be able to tease more out from those guys than maybe other teams have been able to. They have a great track record of doing that. I mean, talk about Joe Musgrove and Nick Pivetta going from talented but inconsistent starters to frontline aces. You talk about Michael King and Seth Lugo going from swingmen to number one type starters. Talk about guys like Blake Snell and Dylan Cease, at least in 24, going from ex-elite pitchers who've been struggling to returning to their Cy Young form. So you feel good about with the Padres pitching infrastructure. They might be okay, even if they do have to go do some more, bargain shopping there. The biggest hire is going to be the hitting coach. Victor Rodriguez took a job at the Astros, and also Tim Leeper, the third base coach, who was very, very highly respected in that clubhouse. He left to go to the Mets. Those are going to be important hires, and I do think that seeing who Craig Stammen and whoever else is on the Padres decision-making team there goes with, that will be critical to the Padres' success this year. I will say, as much as they need to get their manager hire right, they really have to get this hitting coach hire right. And I think that given the makeup of their staff, going with an established hitting coach who has a track record of helping offenses perform to a playoff caliber level is absolutely a must.
There's no question about it. I mean, just a few years ago, we were wondering what the direction was going to be in terms of the pitching coach, because that was an area where you felt like they could use an upgrade. They found the upgrade in Ruben Niebla. It was immediate clear that they've got their guy, and fortunately for them, they've been able to keep their guy now through a couple managerial changes. it looked like in 2024, like people said, I probably said, hey, they found their hitting Ruben Niebla and Victor Rodriguez. 2025, not so convincing, and now he's on his way. And so, I've thought for some time, and others have said it, even when they were replacing Bob Melvin, it felt like, the most important coach on the staff is going to be Ruben Niebla regardless. He can probably still make that case. And if we're saying that now about the hitting coach, whoever they find, that's going to be a huge asset to Craig Stammen and the franchise. And I think, an interesting part of it too will be like, now Jace Tingler didn't have the history with the team, so we didn't have guys. Jason Adams said he's already won over the clubhouse. He doesn't have to do that. He's got the respect of the guys day one in a way that Jace Tingler did not. I think they did a good job of surrounding Jace Tingler with experienced coaches, but it seemed like over time, those coaches were maybe looking at Jace Tingler a little bit sideways, and maybe the voices were
situation was not great.
Maybe they're too big. They had Bobby Dickerson as well, Wayne Kirby as well, Skip Schumacher, who then eventually got the job with the Marlins. Not to suggest any of those guys in particular were an issue, but finding somebody who can be an asset and a resource to Craig Stammen, but maybe won't be too prominent of a voice in the clubhouse, or maybe doesn't necessarily have the aspirations to be in Craig Stammen's seat, just to avoid any sort of friction or who's in charge or this guy's the manager, but this guy seems to be making the decisions and seems to have a better handle on things. I think kind of threading that needle could be important as well, because we did see it get a little bit tenuous in 2021.
No question about it. We will see if Craig Stammen is able to avoid the same pratfalls again, given his track record, given his relationships, given all the things we talked about. I don't think this is a hire that will turn out terribly. I do think that there is a high chance of success in terms of reaching the postseason. It's just about getting to that next level of winning the World Series. It's hard to say without any precedent. But again, there's a first time for everything. We will see what happens. Darnay, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, that'll do it for this edition of Friar Territory here on the Foul Territory Network. Go ahead and give us a review, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, whatever platform you're watching and listening on. We'd love to hear from you. For Darnay Tripp, I'm Kyle Glaser. We'll be back later this week.